Okay, I guess we can get started. Welcome everybody. Happy Friday. I'm Charles Delps, founder of FM BetterForms. But this particular Friday meetup is we'll quickly touch base for some people on what's new in BetterForms. But we really want to introduce a new some foundation for a new module. So I'll get started. Just a couple things we're going to touch base today on these updates. A new headless authentication module, and Eric will lead off that presentation. Quick thanks to Mark Anderson from Florisware. He's a FileMaker developer, and we're using his GoToMeeting today because it supports more than mine does. A couple new things. I'm just going to touch base really quick on what's new in BetterForms since our last meetup. We have a new authorized.net payment gateway, and if you have any questions, please feel free to just jump right in. Don't feel shy to interrupt or anything like that. We want to make these Friday sessions kind of more of a meetup kind of forum type idea, or like a virtual pause on air kind of type of thing, more than a formal presentation. Or at least this one is anyway. So the authorized.net payment gateway is pretty simple, a really easy implementation. This is going to be the third payment gateway we have in BetterForms now. It's pretty simple to use. Unfortunately, authorized.net, the way their API works, you do have to do a little bit more coding in the back end, but it gives you a ton of flexibility that PayPal and Stripe don't have. You can do a lot of card capture related things. It's pretty simple. It triggers from a button, but you can also trigger it from a BetterForms action. If you're not familiar with how actions work in BetterForms, they're like a script step in FileMaker. And basically, you click the button, and the payment gateway opens. You enter your card details, and when you're done, it runs a script in FileMaker, passing you that information back. So that's in production now. There are a couple little nuances that we're still working out with, but as far as being able to use, you can use that right away, and that's in our latest code base at 0.8.16 is the latest build that includes that. We have some new things. This is a really new feature. It's authentication fields and actions. What that means is traditionally or initially, BetterForms had a static login page. So if you wanted to log into an app, you had a fixed login fields. And let me see if I can find something like that. Let's just find one here. All right. So we had this kind of fixed login page. Now we have the ability to totally customize this, just like any other page. So that means you can create login pages that look like this. This is just an example of one where you have a login and a registration and maybe some type of image. You can put these fields any way you want, and I have them in a multi-tab component here, but they don't have to be. Here's another. Oh, I thought that was a different example, but it's not. But they can be set up any way you want. And because these all trigger actions, effectively script steps, that means that you can programmatically log people in, which you couldn't do before. So it's a real powerful thing, and it gives you the ability to really customize your applications and dial those in a little bit more. A few other new things. Card modals. This is almost as I've been told, it's a bit of a game changer. FileMaker introduced card windows, I guess, a couple years ago, and we just introduced them about a couple weeks ago. And basically, the way they work is, let me find an example of one here. So the card window is effectively, it's a layout or a page within another page within a modal window. So here's an example of one that opens up a congratulations progress box for UX and onboarding. But this is just an example of one that we built internally. And you get an idea. You can put anything you want in here. This particular one, you can determine if you want it to be draggable, if you want to be able to click on the background to dismiss it, or if you want to programmatically dismiss it as well. So it can be like a blocking type style modal. So that's really flexible. It has its own context. That means it can talks to your database independently from the background form, and all the actions run locally scoped to here, and you can pass data back and forth. There's some techniques for passing data back and forth. So if you have a list type view and you want to edit a record, this is a great way to doing that. And then you can edit the record, save it, commit it to FileMaker, and then dismiss the box and go back to your list view. So those are also available, and we have a few developers who are already starting to use those, who are testing them out. And I think they're pretty much ready to go, and they're available again in the latest build, 0.16 build. And a couple other really, really cool things that I'm really excited about, actually. If you're pushing the envelope of BetterForms more, and you want to do a lot more client-side coding, we have the ability to add JavaScript into almost everything that we do, and HTML. So in the past, when we wanted to add some JavaScript, we would have to do something like have it inline in the JSON. So it was a little bit of a pain to edit. We'd have to say var, test equals 1, 2, 3, that type of thing. But now what we can do is we can literally click on that, and we can add full JavaScript in here, and we can go ahead and add anything we want, and any code we want. We can reference the data model. So model.name first, for example, equals model dot, or my name, Charles, I guess, here, something like that. So you can do things like that really, really easy. And what that does is that allows you to put big hunks of JavaScript in here. This is a big piece of code. You don't need to know JavaScript for BetterForms, as you know, but it helps when you're doing smaller things that you want to do some really, really advanced stuff like diminishing value lists and pickers and things like that. And this is actually one that is used internal to this pop-up window and to this editor. So this window, or this JavaScript editor, is actually just built in BetterForms, and it's just a card window that pops up, and I can dismiss it, and it actually just injects the code back into the parent window. So that's what that JavaScript there does. But that's probably about as complicated as something that most people would ever write. Usually 2 or 3 lines accomplish whatever you're trying to do. It's usually just some data manipulation. So we have the same thing for, I don't know if this one has any HTML on this page, but we have the same thing for HTML elements, and it opens up as an HTML editor as well. So that's really powerful too, and that it's kind of a game changer in terms of development, because now you can get a preview of what you see is what you get. And let's see, the last thing I just want to mention today quick is a brand new feature is DevTools. My little slideshow here, it pulls data from FileMaker, but if I'm not sure what data it's pulling, I can inspect the outbox in the helper file that BetterForms uses. But I can also click on this little icon here, and I can enable and disable this for my site, and that opens up a developer inspector tool, and that allows me to see the data that's coming in, and I can also see my global app data, and I can see some other information and turn on some more advanced debugging and things like that. So that gives us developers a real advantage to being able to touch your data and manipulate it. And we'll continue to make a lot of refinements on this inspector tool, because it's continuously deployed. It's very easy for us to make iterations on that, and it just seamlessly works with everything. So does anybody have any questions on those items before we carry on to our main stuff? Man, I hear crickets out there. All right, couple other things coming up in terms of.
I hear a cat instead, not crickets.
But. Oh yeah, you know what? My cat. Okay, I apologize for that. So I was just joking around with Eric before the call, and we were saying there's always somebody who has a dog, and the dog's barking. But I have a cat, and my cat is about 20 years old, and I think it's a little. Every now and then it makes these cuckoo noises, and it's whenever I talk, it seems to do that. So it's a little bit. It's on its last legs. All right. A few things coming up with BetterForms. We're going to be at Pause on Air in Tulum, Mexico in April. Louis DePera and I don't know if he's on today. No, I don't see him there. We're going to be talking about web publishing and the state of JavaScript and connecting FileMaker to outside stuff. Louis kind of is a specialist in connecting FileMaker from the API backward side outward. And I guess BetterForms would be probably the dominant application for connecting front ends to FileMaker. So we kind of bookend FileMaker back and forth. So we'll be talking about that and some of our experiences in introducing JavaScript and HTML and CSS and things like that to developers, as well as Louis will be talking about the APIs and things like that too. So that should be really good. I think those sessions are recorded. So if you get a chance, or they're crowdcasted, live broadcasted. So if you get a chance to jump on those, that's going to be in April. I think it's like April the 8th or something. You can Google that. .fmp in Berlin is a like a pause on air, but it's the European version, and it differs from the pause on air in that the sessions are not as touchy feely. There's not much for UI sessions and things like that. They're a little bit more technical, kind of like the original pause sessions were. So they kind of follow that format. But other than that, it's pretty similar. So we'll be talking about BetterForms, and that's actually where we introduced BetterForms as a product, or we made a decision to move it forward as a product and not as a private framework last year. So this is where we've come in the course of a year, I guess. DevCon in August. We'll be there as well. So if you're hitting DevCon, we'll have a small kiosk. Stop by and we can build some stuff. It'll be kind of cool, and we'll be also attending various meetups throughout the course of the year. So that's kind of what's on the short term roadmap. We're going to ignore that for now, and that's it. All right. So what we'll do?
Can we talk to answer Dale's question about user accounts?
Oh, yeah, great.
I think the answer there is yes.
New feature. Yeah. Another new feature is, let me just jump to my thing here. This is coming up. This is in development right now, probably come out in another week or so. You don't have to upgrade or anything like that for this, because it's, and just to make sure, Dale, are you referring to user accounts using BetterForms or user accounts with you and your applications?
You feel free to turn on your mic.
BetterForms, okay. BetterForms, so what we're doing is we're adding, right now, BetterForms is single organization, single user. So we're turning that into a multi-organization and multi-user, because we're starting to see some developers who are working for different, consulting for different companies, and they need that to have that ability. And the way it'll work is you'll go up to your account section at the top and you'll switch organizations. And then as soon as you switch organizations, your homepage will change to that new org, and you'll have access to all that organization sites. Under the account section here, if you have a company that has a whole bunch of users like we do, then you'd be able to set the permissions and change the status for different users and so on. So if I want to take Jason and turn him into an admin, I could do that type of an idea. And you can also add new users from here too. So that'll be rolling out. We're slowly rolling that out, probably over the next week to 2 weeks as we build up the infrastructure. There's a few caveats and some things that have to happen along the way to various parts of our backend code, our BetterForms app. One thing to keep in mind is, don't forget, the editor, the BetterForms editor, is 100% BetterForms app. There is zero custom coding in the user interface that we have advantage, or we have access to, that you don't. There are a couple smaller hidden features, I guess you could say, that we needed to have for the sake of administering the back-end servers and things like that. But other than that, the entire app, the entire front end, is just another application built in on the same framework. So, all right. So I hope that answers your question there. And we'll move back, and we'll move back over to.
What about the app users in FileMaker? Dale asks too.
What do you mean by that? Oh,
okay.
Yeah.
I just unmute myself here a little bit easier. So when we have those new widgets now where we can have login, make our own login pages and registration pages. When a user registers to use a BetterForms app that we built, it was in the past storing that in your platform.
That changed actually quite a while ago.
Okay.
So now you just have to update your helper file. You can find the new helper file at the dashboard. If you go from the dashboard, you can download a new one here. And as soon as you do that, and we upgrade the base code for your site or sites, then that'll automatically switch over to accounts in your file.
Okay, great.
Right, so those are all locally stored, and as well as all your hooks. When somebody's authenticated, they'll all have a user in a global BF underscore user. They'll have an ID key, and you can use that to coordinate your two files.
Awesome.
Super. We'll jump actually into the main thing that we wanted to go over today, which is a headless authentication module. So I'm going to or Eric, you want to jump over and change and become the presenter?
Yeah, there we go. I've got my ham on the screen. That's okay. So can everybody see that? I think. Yeah. So this whole idea was. I know Charles mentioned it in the announcements, I think last week, but building a new headless authentication module that is not just works with BetterForms, but also with other applications. So I'll start with, let's see if there we go. I'll start with what do we mean by headless, right? So basically, it's JSON based. So it's only data that we're going to be managing with this. There's not going to be like a front end, no UI. But that allows it to be used with any system, so really, really flexible. And so once all this is built, anything that you would need for a new integration is just inserting a few custom functions, and then you can tie it to all your things. And I can go into more why it's needed. I don't know if Charles, we didn't really talk much about how it'll work, because part of what we want to do in this meetup too is ask for questions and feedback. Because this hasn't necessarily been built out yet. We have some ideas on how it would work, but we definitely want to get feedback and make sure that it would be useful to everyone, kind of building this as an open source project a little bit.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have built their own kind of authentication. And just to clarify, there's authentication and authorization.
Right.
Authentication is to show who you are. Authorization is what you can do. So there's a subtle difference there. And authentication is easy enough in FileMaker. The people have to log in. It's easy enough in any application, third-party application, because they usually have some kind of login system. But authorization also integrates very heavily into the user interface, because sometimes you want to maybe disable a field on the front end somewhere, or you want to hide something or show them different menus and so on. So we don't really have a solid architecture that is extensible outside of FileMaker as well as inside of FileMaker. And why you'd want that outside of FileMaker is any type of front end. Doesn't matter if you're coding in PHP or doing something in a different framework, or whether it's BetterForms or whatever. You're going to need the ability to maybe hide and show stuff, and based on what that user is allowed to see. On the back end, you may have a totally external system that talks to FileMaker through an API and says, hey, John Smith is at my front door. Do I let him in and to do something? And it may hit an API, and you want that centrally located permission system there. So that's why it's kind of headless, and it's not going to have, we don't really want to be bogged down by the concepts of how the user interface works, and what tables it requires and things like that. And by making it headless and to some degree footless or bottomless, it gives us some really, really big benefits.
Right. It's part of the inspiration for the logo there, the headless hand.
I'm very, that's exactly how I envisioned the logo too, Eric. I like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have fun there. But anyway, so talking more about like why this is needed, right? So, I mean, Charles mentioned this a little bit already, but one of the things that we can't do in FileMaker is edit things like privileges at the higher level. So you've got like privilege sets within FileMaker, and you have specific user accounts, but it's really, really deep down, and it's hard to really get at that data, and it's really hard to make changes on a large scale system. So another reason is we want custom overrides for users that don't fit within groups. So, you might have a group called janitors. Think of a building example instead of software for a second. You might have a group of janitors that all have a key to the storage closets, but maybe you have one nighttime janitor that needs a special key to all the rooms because he's only there at night. And so you don't want to have to create a whole nother group that is almost like janitors, but with one change. So we would, need custom overrides. And the other piece of this, I didn't put it on the slides, but be able to put, inheriting privileges, also setting like default privileges for groups. So you have kind of a front end and a back end of several privilege sets. So you can say the default of this privilege is allow or disallow access. But for this one specific user, we're going to have this override. And the other thing that it does is it makes it really easy to define new groups and inherit privileges between groups. We need that ability if we want to, maybe there is a reason why you want a new janitors group or a new group for a new type of person, but most of that work has already been done in another group. So we would be able to inherit most of the privileges and then set the default group overrides in that way. The other idea of this is that it would use the BetterForms style, and I wasn't sure the word you used here, Charles, but
yeah, I don't know.
It's gonna be flexible and lightweight and kind of just easy and intuitive to use. These are going to be just a couple simple custom functions, but hopefully designed in such a way that it's not too big of a learning curve necessarily, but still really powerful. Thoughtful naming of keys, for example,
And progressive as well. What I mean by progressive is that you can use as little of it as you want or as much as you want. So if the implementation is super easy, you don't mind going into an old legacy file that you've had for 10 years and the customer wants some new little control, some control in some fashion. You can easily add this in there at the head of a script, and that would be more, for the most part, that would be your integration. So you can only use it in that one. You may only use it in that one spot, or you may use it across your entire database. And Eric just touched on how it's really hard. Like FileMaker, we have record level access, but I'd be willing to bet less than 10% of the people who are online here which is like 2, use actual deep record level access, because it's just so hard to access. But this would be some type of a function that sits in that record level if you wanted it to, but it would reference a custom function up higher, which is much more touchable. And that custom function can reference the rest of the code. So if you want to change some kind of logic, you don't have to change it in 50 fields across 30 tables. You change it in one spot, and that propagates downward because they're all indirectly referencing it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And so that gets a little bit to the use cases that we might have. So multi-tenant applications, BetterForms, Charles's front-end app of BetterForms is a perfect example. We talk about it a lot. We talked about it just now with like the organizations and various users. So multi-tenant apps, you can build those kind of apps that have those deep charts of privileges, but also being able to use it in our own apps, like for like we talked about, disabling a button if they don't have access to it. Even though that's just a UI change, of course, the server would still check access or not access. But it's good for the user to know, oh, I don't have access to this specific privilege. Maybe I should request that, or at least they don't get frustrated when they when they try to click on a button and it doesn't work when it looks like it should work, that kind of thing. So lots of other things. But what I really like most about this is just that it can be used anywhere. Like we're really trying to think deep about this as to be how flexible it can be, right? So that it can work in a FileMaker app if you're building a standard just FileMaker desktop app, but if you also want to extend that out to a front-end UI like BetterForms or literally any other platform, because it's based in JSON, so it can go anywhere. So, and that was all the slides I have, but I don't know if you want to jump in more, Charles. But
yeah, no. So that's kind of the general idea. So imagine you have a JSON object that defines all your privileges. You have, we'll call it admin, and they have, can see this, can see that, and a bunch of Booleans, or maybe numbers, or whatever the value is that you're evaluating against. And then you have another object. Actually, Eric, do you have that JSON kind of sample you had? And you have
I'm gonna
another
pull that
object
up real
where somebody's
quick.
down a little bit from the admin, maybe a manager, floor manager, or something like that. So here's an
So
example
yeah,
of let's look at the bottom one first,
kind of our
actually.
thoughts.
So
Okay.
imagine you have, this is just kind of a conceptual idea. So here we have three levels of users: an admin, a cage manager, and a student. Eric's an in-house dev at a university, so this is more kind of geared towards his use case. So admin, cage manager, and student. And the admin has the first key says inherit, and from there you can inherit, that admin inherits all privileges below that you specify. So you can make, and quite often we use the word admin and say, like, as if it's a super user and they can have everything, but they may not. I mean, however you define it. So this admin inherits cage manager, but the cage manager also happens to inherit all of the attributes of the student. Now, I don't know if you have an example in here, but if you inherit something from a lower level, you may want to have the ability to override that as well.
Yeah, so that's what these do here. So like a student, as an example, they might be able to they can edit their own reservations. That's kind of the idea here. But a cage manager, edit reservations is set to all. So it first would look through, inherit all the privileges,
Right.
and then these are either overrides or additions to just this cage manager level. And then the admin, you can see that really, at least in this case, they can only do a few extra things that the cage manager can do. So we don't need to retype all those things. It's just going to say, I'm going to inherit what the cage manager does.
Exactly. And then the user would have attributes from, so a given user, let's say myself, I might have an attribute of a cage manager. So therefore, when I define that user, I think you have that above now.
Yeah. So
right?
then, your user object would just be a flat list of all your privileges.
That's right. But when you're defining the user, which is an object we don't have an example of here. When you're defining the user, that user is a cage manager plus that one extra function that particular person, because they come in on Fridays.
Right, the override.
Yeah, the override that they can have. So that's kind of the idea of the flexibility that we want to incorporate into this. And what we really want to do is get a bit of a dialogue to hear what your use cases are, and to see if something that we're doing now, if there's an unknown that that can become a known, so we can basically program it out right now. That's kind of the goal. So does anybody have any questions, or conceptually, is this resonating with anybody? Hate to use that new age word, but
yeah.
I would say jive, but that's too old for me. So I don't, my generation we don't have a good word for that, I don't think.
Right. I'd like to imagine that we're not the only ones that need this kind of thing. So how is it going to look on the front end? Well, that would be up to the developer, as far as like how you display this to the user, if that's the question. Basically, you'd be able to, so for BetterForms as an example, when someone logs into your application in BetterForms, this object of all of their privileges would be passed in some accessible key that you can then use with visible calculations to say hide this button or disable it, or show a different message or something. Right. So like in BetterForms, that would be that example. But in FileMaker, it might be totally different. As far as like developing and checking against these privileges, that's where it comes down. We've written kind of like some test privileges here. So let's say the custom function is named check priv. I want to check the edit reservations privileges, and that's going to return a Boolean, yes or no, can I do that? And if I can't, then, do some action, exit the loop, my error loop.
So this is some pseudocode that would sit literally at the beginning of your API script. When I say API, it's these internal APIs. You have a script that creates a new user, a script that deletes a user, changes a user. So this would sit at the head of that. And that would be as much as you'd have to say. And if you're using a one loop, single iteration loop type error trapping scheme, you could literally just say exit loop if check privilege, or if not check privilege, edit reservations. And that would be it.
Right.
In the configuration, for this architecture would already know what your user table is and would already know how to find all of that information. So it doesn't need any, it's not jumping to any tables, it's not committing any records, it's not leaving any context in FileMaker or changing anything. And the advantage again to that is now you can use it anywhere and not have to worry about it breaking. It's a lot, you reduce fragility quite a bit by not being dependent on layouts. My experience has been super performant, to do quick execute SQLs on this type of data to fetch that data as well.
Right.
So just going back to Dan's question, how does it look on the front end? You don't actually see anything on the front end because it is headless. If you want to wrap the front end up in a pretty interface, you're absolutely welcome to do that. But the idea is that if I don't want to put an interface, as soon as I put an interface in FileMaker, I have a bunch of code, I have tables, I have layouts, and I have scripts that's going to have to manage it. And it becomes more accessible, more touchable to the user. So in theory, it's more hackable as well. When the user can't get access, there is no layout to go to. It's just the script, and the script is referencing some custom function code. That's where most of the integration would be. As far as storing the actual object, that bigger JSON object that we saw earlier there, that would be stored in wherever you decide to store it. If you have a preferences table, that would probably be one field in the preferences table, but that would be single field. And I would probably just store it in as a large text item, so you can just literally type in text, right? I think you're going to have to become comfortable with JSON anyway, so it shouldn't be a problem. And then you just edit the keys as needed, and you can add new keys as you're developing. I'm adding new widget feature 1, so I just hit enter widget feature 1 true for a cage manager, false for student, and I'm done. All right, now I've just added a new privilege set, and it just propagates because it's an object, and there's nothing else to handle there. One other real bonus about it, not being necessarily hard bound to a table, to a footless, if you want to call it. I don't know if there's not a really good term, I don't think, for that, is that now you can take this code and you can use it in the subset of code in a smaller example. Now this is kind of like a bit of inception here, but if you think about BetterForms in general as an application, I'm just going to use that as an app because it's one I've been spending my life on. We have a bunch of organizations that have accounts. And so we have, say, 50 organizations that have accounts, and we want to make sure that when somebody edits a record, they can't somehow, anything that comes into the browser is hackable, and including in FileMaker, anything that comes into a FileMaker client is hackable. It's just harder. So you want to have maybe some code that's going to say, does this person own the account? But within that account, I may want to say my users, my brand new rookie user who I just hired yesterday, I only want to give him read access to these particular sites and projects, but I want him to work on his own little smaller project. So, but he can read and reference and cut and paste code from other areas of the project. That's fine, but I don't want him screwing anything up. So that's kind of a subset of privileges, totally independent from these other privileges that are functioning in this environment. So the idea here is if you can root the source data, this JSON object, and you can define it where it comes from, now you can use the same architecture, the same privilege set inside an application that has a bigger privilege set around it. So that's kind of a little bit tricky to wrap your head around maybe, but in certain use cases, it's super, super powerful, and mainly multi-tenant apps. And I think you say, well, I don't have a multi-tenant app, but actually a lot of things are multi-tenant. Like, for example, Eric has two campuses, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. So those
yeah. So we use
campus, yeah, those are effectively tenants, right? So because they have separate environments for the most part. So.
Right.
Does anybody foresee any use cases where this kind of architecture would not work, or you wouldn't understand how it would work? That's really what we want to do, is so we can get some feedback. And by all means, just jump on the microphone, please. You can even show your camera, unless you're sitting in your underwear. Then I don't. More crickets. Like my cat died too.
Yeah, no cats either.
Yeah, I'm gonna call my cat Schrodinger. I'm gonna change its name. I never know. All right. How about has anybody written any type of existing? How are you handling privileges now? Are you just doing it in scripts and looking up the user, going to the user record and asking if checking if a feature is turned on, and then doing an if then and continue?
So we're actually using we use a combination of a bunch of different things, but one thing that we do that is different from others that I've experienced is we use extended privileges, and then use the get extended privilege name, set names, or whatever it is function to check against those privileges. So we kind of like put a shim at the beginning of some of our scripts, and then that way, not only do you have your privilege sets from the different FileMaker privilege sets, but you also have more granular privileges inside of those sets that you can assign to separate people. So we'll use that for things like allows API access or something like that.
Right.
Where,
That's it. That's really interesting. I guess the limitation there is that you can't do any type of inheritance, so you can't do any hierarchy, right? And you can't. I guess you could wrap that up with some custom functions if you wanted to use it outside. Like if I had an API that calls in because it has a totally separate system, but I want the privileges to be configured in the main FileMaker app, I guess I could call an API still, like an endpoint of some sort, and authenticate against that in a script. Is that how you do that, Mike?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But, like I said, it's a combination. It's not something we use exclusively for every file, but it's something to toss in there to think about as you're building. Just
so I understand fully, what would be the advantages of that? I mean, it's a place to store the data. So effectively, you're storing some attributes within the extended privileges versus in a record. Are there other advantages to that? It's less hackable, I guess. Even if somebody has read-write access, they couldn't change it. They need a developer access.
It's more transportable, I've found too. It's easier to reference stuff out of the privilege settings than it is to try to store it in a table. Then if you store it in a table, you have to hydrate that at the beginning of every session into whatever session model, and then it becomes hackable because you're storing it maybe.
I see.
So it becomes more of like a session attribute that is automatically created for you versus having to do something to create it yourself.
Just to reiterate what Mike was saying is that when you log in, let's say you put some bunch of stuff in globals, it's much more hackable. I don't think these actually have to be set into any globals, though. Although somewhere the data has to be stored somewhere, right? So the user specific attributes has to be stored somewhere, or the roles, and the overall schema has to be stored somewhere. That, in theory, could actually be pulled from anywhere. It doesn't even have to be on this machine. It can be pulled at the beginning of a session or something like that, or every time. But I don't think you actually need to instantiate any variables for this to work, because the custom functions can quickly look up the user information and the overall schema on the fly. So I think that will mitigate that problem.
Right. Just directly from like the users table or even the external API, because potentially you could be using a totally different system that's not even FileMaker to store the user's privileges. Is that right? And so then these custom functions could requence.
Well, this is something that we didn't mention, is the transportability. Because quite often we have more than one file that a system is coming in, but the one file is some kind of UI, and then you want to maybe add some integration lower level some privileges at a lower level in a second or third file, you can pass in a script call to that other file. If you're, depending on how your architecture is, you can pass the object information, and that will route the authentication or the authorization system. What I mean by route, it will give it its source data. So it doesn't have to actually come from the table in that system. You can pass it the information, and it's just a set of logic that's going to evaluate to some type of truthiness. So I think from a transportable aspect, you can have 2 or 3 or 4 files, and you can, in those calls to those other files, you can actually pass information to that'll of that user object. So in that case, it's you are instantiating a variable, but you're also doing that if you're calling a script anyway. So it's the same difference. But that could be very, very, very doable. Or these other files could actually reference your first file. So there's a very light integration. And you're still again keeping all your privileges in a single file for as many files as you want. Anybody else have any ways of doing stuff? Because that's an interesting, really interesting thing to think about. Somebody's scrambling with a hamburger trying to put it down and looking for their mute, right? That's what I'm hoping. Okay. So this would, and we're just really kind of winging this here right now, just trying to get an idea, not trying to be too restrictive in the thinking. But this is primarily an architecture of functions, custom functions. And we'd probably have some type of configuration custom function that you would set up that would have to point to your user table and to your preferences table or wherever you're storing your overall schema.
I've named it ham.carve. Ham carve.
Yeah.
Carve it. cut off. Just for fun.
We're trying not to be too hammy with the names, but anyhow. Or maybe ham bone, or I don't know. So anyhow, those are that's kind of the gist of this new module that we want to work on. If you're interested in contributing, we'd love to hear your feedback. Now would be really, really good. But if you have some thoughts on stuff, please by all means contact us. You can join our Slack. We may create a new channel for it. I've been trying not to have too many channels in our Slack group because I see some Slacks and they got 200 channels and you just can't keep up on that stuff. I just want to quickly browse through a single or 2 or 3 channels. But we will probably create an open repo for this in GitHub, and as we start developing it, try to gain some more insight from everybody and how it can be used. It will also kind of become a dominant way that BetterForms uses authentication for people who are building bigger applications. And we've already had a use case where I have a navigation bar that's very dynamic that changes based on who's logged in and what they can see. And, even looking at one record shows different navigational items than another record and things like that. So this is definitely something, an architecture that would be used, because I've seen that already, with a number of cases.
Hey, Charles, this is Trevor out in Michigan.
Hey, Trevor.
I have a thought. Just this makes perfect sense to me for a web application where you need to control, all of the roles and privileges of a user or their group. I have reservation thinking about it in the context of purely FileMaker, where I am using it on the web and also in FileMaker. My thought is around, well, what if you don't have a good connection, or my thoughts would be around, I would rather ask the master repository for the permissions and all of these settings, and then cache them just so it's fast in FileMaker.
Let me just to clarify something. We just threw it out there that it's theoretically possible to use an external system. I wouldn't do that. If it's in FileMaker, it should be native to FileMaker. So you wouldn't
Okay,
have,
that's a
yeah.
good
So you,
clarification because
yeah, yeah. So I just threw that out there saying that if you had it, let's say you had a FileMaker Go app and it works offline, but you want to centrally at the home base set all what that user can do within that app. And so that app maybe at some point would download this schema object and the user object one time, just like you said, and locally cache that, and then just authenticate that so it can function offline. But now you still have your home base, your main app on the server controlling as a source of truth or a source of logic in this case. Does that make sense?
yeah, thanks for the clarification. I agree completely.
Yeah. And the reason for using JSON is because we can create large data structures and recursive style data structures like this inherit stuff. You can use that in one single field, and we can use it in one single variable. So it makes it really, really great for like a little micro database rather than having all this, integration of another table and all this kind of stuff. Right now you can just integrate it super, super easy. And it's small enough objects that it's fast. So
Yeah.
okay, super. Well, we're going to finish up. Just a couple quick things I'll mention really, really quick here. Just to do my due diligence. Right, I'm going to switch back to my screen here for a quick sec. We are almost finished our, I don't want to say almost, well, we've only had a few more months of our VIP program in with BetterForms. This pricing is ending actually on Monday, and we're moving up to our next tier, which is going to be about $200 more approximately. And our final targeted price will be about $14.50 for the top end plan, and we'll have some smaller plans of around $400 and about $700 roughly in between there, and a free plan as well. The free plan will be pretty restrictive, to be honest with you. You won't be able to have any monetization or anything like that on your app. Single FileMaker database and single server and things like that. But the high end, this one here, the plan that everybody has right now. Some of you guys started off and it was about 2/3 of the price. It's slowly climbing up as we finish the product. We do appreciate your support. I think we got a pretty good thing going here, and if you've been actively developing, you'll come to appreciate the flexibility that you have on the front end. So that's going to be ending this. I think that's Monday. And if you want to take advantage of that, just contact myself. You can do it right through our website or visit vip.fmbetterforms.com right here, and that'll take you to a contact page as well, which happens to be a BetterForms page. And I think we're all done. We do have a hard stop at 11:50 today, right? Eric, thank you very much for your input there today, and to our 20 or so participants, please by all means reach out. We're going to record this and we'll send a copy of the link once it renders and whatnot over the next few days. Okay, I think that's it then. All right. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great weekend.